Okay, I am here with my good friend John Mark Comer. John Mark, thanks for being on Theology in a Raw for the second or maybe even third time, at least second time.
I think second. Yeah, I know. You don't love me quite enough for three. We'll see if I pass. I made it on a second time. That's a step in the right direction.
I don't know if I don't think I've had anybody on three times. I've only had a
Oh,
small
sure.
handful of guests that
Sure.
I've had
Sure.
on
We know
three times.
Francis Chan has been on 19 times. I
He's
mean,
been on
come on.
once. Okay, why don't we start with your book? Because I mean, this
Get
is
it
a
out of the
topic.
way.
What I love about your writing is every book you write is just it seems to be just a piece of you. Would that be true? I mean, you don't just write a book like, oh, here's an interesting topic. Like, it seems to be just something that you're living, you're breathing, it's keeping you up at night. You're thinking through it. Maybe you've had a life experience that is significantly, played a foundational role in even producing this book. And I can imagine this book probably has a lot of that in it.
Yeah, I mean, this one for sure, more than the other ones before it. And this is really my first kind of foray into writing about spiritual formation, which is really what I want to devote the next decade or two to as a teacher and writer. And the odd thing and the beautiful thing about spiritual formation is it's a little bit different than Bible and theology, though there's a ton of Bible and theology in that you can't teach it in the abstract. You have to live it because it's all about like, how do we actually follow Jesus and grow and mature, and how does the Bible and theology interact with our human psyche and the human condition and our wounding and our hurt and hurry and the iPhone and busyness and all of the stuff,
Yeah.
So like I can exegete Ephesians chapter 2 without like really bringing a ton of my life through it. Now that's not the way to do it and blah blah blah, but you can, as you know. But I can't like teach on how to actually grow and expand the soul into Christ likeness without living that. So there's something beautiful about spiritual formation that forces me to live it first. I was reading a commentary on St. John of the Cross and his work around the dark night of the soul. And Gerald May, his interpretation of St. John was that he started with experience, and then he wrote poetry, and then last he wrote commentary on his poetry, his experience.
Oh, wow.
And that was kind of the flow: experience, poetry / prayer, writing commentary. And that's really kind of the flow, right? You know what I mean? As a teacher, like you experience something with God, and at first it's poetry and mystery and prayer, and you're not even sure. And then eventually you figure out how to articulate it, to the best of your ability.
So the book again is the Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, which is a brilliant title. Did you? Because I'm in the middle of coming up with the title for my forthcoming book, and it's really hard. I feel like I could recognize a good title.
It's the worst, huh?
Did you come up with this, or did the publishers, or both, or?
Actually, I think this was credit has to go to my agent. I think the original title was like "Hurry, the Great Enemy of Spiritual Life," and he was like, "No, that's lame." But I was using that quote, "You must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life." That's the beginning of the book, from that quote from Willard. And so I think my agent said, "Hey, why don't we just take that as the title?"
Just not last Sunday, but the week before, my pastor got up, and this was one of his four he drew like an X through the whiteboard or whatever, and says, here's 4 areas of kind of spiritual formation or just the Christian life that I really want us to think about this year. And one of them was, and even said the Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. It held up your book, read a bunch of quotes from it, and it's
really
yeah.
Oh my gosh! Oh, what a gift!
Oh yeah. And he told everybody, go buy this book. So
that's wonderful.
It's a small church. Look at your
great. You just paid for one kid's college. Thank you.
So what is it that led? What's your story? What happened in your journey that ultimately kind of led to this book? There's got to be a story here. I mean, I know there is because you told me about it a little bit, but
I mean, there's a ton of backstory. I don't want to like give you the 4-hour autobiography, but I mean, I guess the short version, to make it as concise as I can, is I hit a spot as a follower of Jesus and as a pastor about 7-8 years ago now, where I was into decade 3. I was in my early 30s, and I had really stalled out in my spiritual formation, if you want to use that language. And all I mean by that is my growth and maturity into a person who is loving and joyful and peaceful like Jesus. And And I had this experience of where I really felt, we use the language of spiritual growth. I don't think most people even know what they mean by that.
Yeah.
But, I define spirituality in the Christian tradition as our capacity to receive and give love in relationship to God and to others. So by that definition, I felt like I was growing at a spiritual level, like my capacity to receive and give love in relationship to God and other people was growing through my kind of high school, college, 20s. And then, about my mid 20s, I felt I just hit this, I felt like I just hit this plateau and I stalled out in my growth. I was still a Christian. I was still following Jesus. I was still, practicing my spiritual disciplines. But the moment that my apprenticeship to Jesus hit up against some of the deeper stuff, some of the, Enneagram's the fad right now, but that kind of stuff, like the ingrained habits of sin in my person that are literally my genetic code and stretch back to my great great grandfather, and the stuff of our culture that is just the assumptions I carry to the table and wounding from the past. Like the moment it hit all of that stuff, it's like all of a sudden I was just banging my head against a wall, And if you think about, so I had this frustrating experience where for a number of years I just felt stalled out. And then we had planted a church. It grew crazy fast. And all of a sudden, I was the lead pastor of a mega church. And I was under an enormous amount of stress and, workaholic, insane hours. And then the iPhone comes in, and now I'm distracted all the time. And digital addiction is a thing. And so then actually, I felt that I began to regress, not progress, just due to emotional unhealth, distraction, exhaustion, burnout, anxiety, And so there was a real kind of early midlife crisis of not so much a crisis of faith as much as a crisis of discipleship. Like this is not, and once you get to your early 30s, you have enough time under your belt to kind of chart a trajectory for your character forward a few decades and imagine yourself at 40, 50, 60, 70. And, and most 20 somethings don't even think about that. And you get to a certain age where all of a sudden it starts to loom on the horizon. And it was really sobering, a vision of myself at 50, 60, 70 was not a compelling picture for me. So there was that. And then there was, at the same time, there was a bit of a pastoral crisis along parallel lines.
John, real quick, the audio kind of seems to be coming in and out a little bit. I don't know, for the recording it might be fine. Is there anything you can do to, are you Delta 1 to air traffic control? Land the plane.
You know it. This is just, they make these for selfies.
That sounds 100% better there.
Does it?
Yeah.
Okay. Great.
Do you remember where you were? Shoot. Oh, you're envisioning yourself.
Yeah. And then at the same time, there was a very parallel or in parallel kind of pastoral crisis where I began to realize that my church was full of, not my church, but the church I was a part of was full of people like me, that all sorts of people who, you could, to put it in sports language, had some early wins when they first started following Jesus, but then stalled out the moment that discipleship hit the really deep stuff. And I mean, think about the stories that we often tell in church and just in our communal circles of healing and transformation. They're often early in the journey stories. They're often I was addicted to whatever, or my life was a disaster. And these are beautiful stories. It's not to negate them or discount them. We rarely tell stories about over 30 years, Jesus made me a patient person, or God radically healed me of a father wound over, 15 years of patiently sitting with that in Jesus, So I began to just really realize that something in the way that I was following Jesus and the way that we as a church were following Jesus was not right. And that's a much longer conversation. That's what brought me to spiritual formation. That's what brought me to really beginning to ask the question, how do people change? Because spiritual growth is a form of change. So you can't grow if you don't have some kind of a working theory of change. And I think everybody has a working theory of change, but in my experience, for most people, it's subconscious, not conscious, and it's inherited, not intentional. So you just kind of grow up in your church tradition or socioeconomic tradition, and you have some kind of a working theory of this is how I think I grow and mature to become more like Jesus as I follow him. And it might be really good and it might be really bad and it might be a mixed bag, but I'd never even thought about it. It was just an unquestioned assumption that in my kind of evangelical upbringing, well, yeah, you just kind of go to church on Sunday, you read your Bible and pray in the morning. Prayer was defined as intercessory prayer. You tithe, and then you just work really hard at it. And, you know, we would say rely on the Spirit, but that was at a cliche level. I never had any grasp of what that meant or how you actually do that practically or how it actually works or, you know, all that kind of stuff. And of course, those are all good things that are still very much in my rule of life and my muscle memory, and I very much am for. But those things often do not deal with the deep subterranean wounding of the soul and just brokenness of the soul, you know. So all of that brought me to spiritual formation in general, which in turn brought me to Dallas Willard, which in turn brought me to his famous line about hurry, which was a watershed moment in my life, realizing, oh wow, hurry is kind of the root issue underneath all of these other issues in my formation and my health and my life.
What's the quote?
So the quote is, the quote is, hurry is the great enemy of spiritual life in our day, and you must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. That's
Okay.
the quote.
Oh, so
Yeah.
that's where the title came from. Okay.
Yes, exactly. And the story is a great backstory. It's a line, actually. It's not in one of his books. It's a line that he said to John Ortberg when Ortberg was actually on staff at Willow Creek Community Church. This is many years ago, late 90s, I want to say, and was getting kind of sucked into just the busyness and hurry and overload of life and megachurch culture, and called up Willard and basically said, what do I need to, you know, in his own language, what do I need to do? And Willard was just quiet and said, you need to ruthlessly eliminate hurry. He identified hurry as like the issue underneath all of the other issues. And that to me was so striking. I live in Portland, again, like crazy far left, uber secular, super post-Christian city. And I'd never thought of hurry as really the great threat and challenge, even more than any of the other stuff.
And you felt that in your life. You were just going from thing to thing to thing. I mean, I was reading on the Amazon page of your book. I got to read this. This is so, it was hilarious. So you said it's Sunday night, 10 p.m., head up against the glass of an Uber, too tired to even sit up straight. I taught 6 times today. Yes, 6. The church I pastor just added another gathering. That's what you do, right? Make room for people. I want to come back to that. That I got some thoughts and questions about that. I made it until about talk number 4. I don't remember anything after that. I'm well beyond tired, emotionally, mentally, even spiritually. When we first went to 6 services, I called up this megachurch pastor in California who had been doing 6 for a while. How do you do it? I asked. Easy. He said, just think about, it's just like running a marathon once a week. Okay, thanks.
He's this total jock, like athlete kind of guy.
Yeah. Isn't a marathon really hard? I cracked up at that. It keeps going on and on and on. But I mean, I'm like, oh, easy. Once a week marathons.
Yeah, great. Awesome. Once a week. Yeah, and the funny thing is, so I immediately got into long distance running, which actually really did help for that season of my life. And he had an affair and totally disappeared from church.
Really?
Yeah, like that does not bode well for my future, you know?
Yeah.
But that was a good sobering moment for me.
What was it? Here's a question I ask myself sometimes. For you, was it the number of hours you were clocking? I mean, were you working 60, 70, 80 hours a week? If you add up anything that can be considered work from a pastoral perspective, was it the number of hours, or was it simply the kinds of things you were doing, or both and?
Yeah, definitely both and. It was it was definitely too many hours. But then it was also me attempting to be somebody I'm not. And, you know, I think to operate outside of my calling and what I have grace for. And I had to learn the hard way. I'm not a leader of leaders, apostolic kind of, you know, that's just that's not how I'm wired. You know, it's not I don't think it's what God made me for. Parker Palmer has that great line about how burnout isn't always a function of giving too much. It's often a function of giving something that's not yours to give in the first place, which is why people can work 40 or 50 hours a week and still burn out, because, you know what I mean? And other people can work 90 hours a week, or not 90 hours, but can work 70 hours a week and be full of life and energy and creativity and passion. A lot of it has to do with what your time is going to.
You and I think, are almost the exact same. Like, you're a 3, right, on Enneagram? Or
I'm not, actually.
oh, you're not? Why?
Mm-hmm. I actually do. I feel like such an idiot, but this is a total rabbit trail. But I'm, I have mixed feelings about the Enneagram,
Okay.
and I'm not sure that I feel weird. I feel like totally pretentious saying I don't want to say my number, but I don't want to say my number.
No, it's fine. So I thought you. So I'm not. I don't know much about the Enneagram. I've never taken the test. I think I'm a 3.
Yeah.
I don't know. People say different things, but so I mean, you're very much introverted.
Yes,
But like a lot
100%.
of pastors that are introverted, you're really good on stage. You can speak to thousands, move the crowds, but put you in a small group and say, all right, lead these 10 people you'd probably just wither up and die. Like, that's how I would much rather be on a stage in front of 2,000 people than in a room with 8 people.
Yeah, or one-on-one, doing like spiritual direction, or having a nice glass of wine in a deep conversation. That's great.
Yeah. But like writing, reading, thinking, reflecting, doing deep work on an intellectual level.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the one-on-one spiritual direction kind of pastoral work, but as long as it's not like, 50 hours a week, but all the like running of a community, the community organization, management of a staff, like none of that is my jam.
And you were doing that, right? That's what it means to be a megachurch pastor. And
Yeah, I mean, we had like 93 people on the payroll at Zenith, and at that point, you're not a teacher, you're you're an executive director of a nonprofit, which is great. I'm not against that at all. That's just not
right.
what I want to do.
So what do you do now? What's your schedule like now? I'm curious.
Oh, the $1,000,000 question.
Yeah, like, what do you
It's
practically?
it's in flux. It keeps changing, and we keep I'm in a totally different role now, and Sundays are still a pretty long day, nothing like they used to be, but we have 3 gatherings, and the last one's not till 7 o'clock at night. So Sunday's a kind of a long day, and which means Monday's a bit of a recovery day. But most of the time in the mornings, I just pray and read and work on my sermon study, right, until about 11:30 or 12 if I can swing it, and my phone's totally off. I don't look at my phone till about middle of the day. And then I'll exercise and then do kind of pastoral leadership stuff in the afternoons, meetings and stuff like that. So it's a little bit more complex than that, but
What's your
basically
day?
that.
Do you have 1 or 2 days off? Friday, Saturday,
Yep,
Sunday?
Friday, Saturday off. Friday's day off, so I do all the work I don't get paid for on that day, and sometimes do author stuff or run errands or just read if I don't have anything going on. And then Friday night and all day Saturday is like deep Sabbath rest, phone off, around the table, family, don't go out. It's just like deep, deep rest and delight.
So what do you do? The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. What about somebody that say? Actually, let me really rethink. So I asked the right question. I haven't read the book yet. Not yet. I'm going to. It seems like it's born out of your pastoral experience, right? Are you speaking mainly to people in ministry? I mean, obviously you're going to say what I was saying, it applies to everybody, but what about, say, I don't know, the mechanic that his wife left him and he's trying to raise 3 kids and he's got to work an extra night job. Like, so I was raised by a single mom who had to work, 14, 18 hours, 16 hours a day to put food on the table, and
Yep.
to barely, like, we were really poor.
Just to get by, yeah.
Yeah, and if I could imagine if she, I don't even know. Again, let me assume if she read your book, she might be a little frustrated, saying, "Well, it must be nice, like,
Yep.
where you can kind of like not do this or not do that, or I'm not going to work too hard today or take this day off." She's like, I physically can't do that.
Yep.
Does what you're saying, is it very contextual to like people in ministry, or is it?
It's not at all contextualized to people in ministry. I mean, that's my story, so I tell a little bit of autobiography, which comes through that. But no, it's not remotely contextualized or geared at pastors or ministry leaders. It is to a degree geared at middle class and up people in, you know, kind of the digital age or in metropolitan centers, absolutely.
Okay.
But my experience has been a little bit different than what a lot of people go to the hypothetical scenarios, and your mom is not a hypothetical scenario, but that's also a different era, pre-iPhone era, you know. And so people will go to the hypotheticals, but in real life, my experience, and again, this is just anecdotal, but has been that busyness is like across every socioeconomic factor that you could possibly imagine. Like if you just ask people, how you doing? Most people say, oh, I'm good, but busy.
Yeah.
And I hear that from everybody. I hear that from men. I hear that from women. I hear that across the ethnic spectrum. I hear that from urban to suburban to rural. I hear that across generations. I hear that from like super hard driving lawyer people and down to like part-time students that are like playing video games 30 hours a week, you know.
Okay.
And everybody that I talk to is busy. And often, you know, we go to the hypothetical scenario of the poor, and that is a very legitimate thing. And I would say two things there. One, most of those on the lower socioeconomic end of the bar, you know, thing, the problem is not too much work, it's not enough work. That is
Yeah.
most problems there. And two, those people for the most part are not reading my books or listening to your podcast. I mean, you know the stats on podcasts. The average podcast listener makes $81,000 a year and has a bachelor's degree. So, you know, the kind of people that are reading a book about Hurry and listening to a podcast are likely not the kind of people like your mom who are just
Yeah.
trying to get to the end of the week, and they probably don't need to be told to slow down. They
Right.
need to be told, like, how do you cultivate, you know, how do we help you and how do you get through it?
Yeah.
But for people with an iPhone, for people who are middle class and up, for people in any kind of even close to a metropolitan setting, man, it's just like the crushing and crippling, you know, I think a thing. So yes, in that respect, this book is not written for, you know, it's not written for people in the developing world. It's not written for people that are, you know, really on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. And I absolutely be honest about that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. That's super helpful. Um, do you, and a lot of this is just personal too, because I'm constantly, but how to say battling? I don't know. Like, I feel like my life, especially my ministry life, has been one of like seasons of like, you know, there was one season where I was trying to pay off just a pile. I mean, a pile of student debt.
Yeah.
So I was working, you know, gosh, yeah, some days I'd work 18 hours a day, get up at 6, work till 1, 2 in the morning, because I wanted to pay off this debt in 5 years, you know.
Yeah.
And then now the last, I would say 4 or 5 years, there's a lot more traveling and speaking. I would say maybe 2 years ago, my family, maybe 3 years ago, we really became vigilant as a family to figure out, okay, it seems like traveling and speaking is kind of wrapped up into what I'm doing. I can find a different calling and we can go that route. But in terms of what I'm doing now, how can we um, figure out a manageable way to do that? So then we become much more ruthless at, you
Yeah.
know, for me taking time off before I travel, taking time off after. I don't hit the desk right when I get home the next morning. I
Yeah.
keep kids on with my trips and making it
Yeah.
integrated with the family, and I have the freedom to be able to do some of that. We've also built in like a really long vacations. Like spring is a lot of traveling, man. It's a lot. Come June, my whole family's out of the country. Like we're gone.
Yeah.
I don't even take a computer, nothing. I mean, I
Yeah.
might check email once in a while, but it's like I need to physically leave the country to just, it's like one big brain fart, you know.
Yeah.
And now even at the fall, sometimes we plan in something if we can afford something there. And the summer can be pretty low key. Like I don't travel during the summer, so the summer is really um, a long. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm working, you know,
Wonderful
but it's,
time.
you know, it's normal hours. It's in my basement here. We take time off to go hiking and stuff. So, I guess my question is, what is my question? What would you? I mean, pastor me now. I mean, just let's. I mean, I know that we're talking in front of thousands of people right now, but I would genuinely love some pastoral counsel. Like, um, it, it, my explanation? Does that sound pretty good, or what kind of advice would you have?
No, I mean, I think it sounds like you're on the wisdom journey. And, obviously most people don't have the life of a traveling speaker and theologian podcaster guy. So I think that you're very much on the journey and you're learning how do I, it's one thing like how do I pay off school debt quick is a different question than how do I maintain fruitfulness and faithfulness over 50 years, and how do I operate in love and in joy and in wisdom, and how do I not lose the plot line along the way. That's a very different question, and they're both appropriate questions for different seasons of life. And at some point you realize that hustle is just, I mean, it'll wear you down to the bone. I think I would just say, yeah, that's great. Sounds like you're on the journey. That's wonderful. All good things. I would just say, what would it look like for you in your ministry to recognize hurry and busyness as one of the primary problems that people are facing in their apprenticeship to Jesus? And I'm convinced that one of the main reasons that millennials and Gen Z are being so colonized by post-Christian secular assumptions and worldview is simply due to busyness, phone, digital distraction, lack of time to just sit in prayer, sit in quiet, sit in the scriptures, be in community with other followers of Jesus. All of this takes a lot of time. You're about to launch this whole beautiful course around sexuality and whatever. That takes time.
Yeah.
People who don't have time won't do it. And even people who do have enough time to do it, but don't actually have time to sit in it and process it and pray about it and discuss it with friends and live it out. So I would just encourage you to begin to take that and put your pastoral eyes on that as you do your itinerant work. What would it look like? I mean, Henry Nouwen, I just reread his little book on Christian leadership, and he has this great paragraph. I remember the first time I read it, it was the main thing that stuck out to me too. And it's same thing the second time through, where he talks about our job, and he's talking about pastors and priests or spiritual leaders. And I think it very much would apply to you. Our job is the opposite of distraction, which is this great line. And then he basically just talks about our job is to help people slow down and pay attention to the very real presence of Christ in their lives. And our question is not how do we keep people busy in our parish, but how do we keep people from being so busy that they lose God in the busyness of life,
And if we're not doing it, we can't teach others to do
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm like, as a leader, I am way less rah than ever, and more like, how do I even cultivate environments when I travel or at our own church of quiet and of listening and of sitting and, you know what I mean? And helping people to actually, I think it's one of the great gifts that the church can bring over the next few decades is actually creating places where people can get free of their phone and actually come back to God and their soul.
All right, you got me inspired. I'm going to do something here online. Oh, okay. You see that? Wait, shoot. Not Siri. All right, check this out, dude. In honor of you. Boop. Delete. Gone.
What did you delete? I couldn't tell.
Twitter from my phone.
Oh, good man. There you go. That's smart.
It's funny. I deleted. I've done that before through a season. But I deleted Facebook a while back from my phone, and I've never put it back on. I don't miss it.
Yeah, 100%.
But the one thing, Twitter is the one thing. I typically, because I get a lot of my news from there, but then I'm looking at the news section in Twitter, and it's all like,
bro, you should not get your news from Twitter. You need to pay for news. Like, seriously, if there's anything that you need to pay for, it's journalism. Because Twitter will just feed you into the digital algorithm that'll lock you in the echo chamber and the angry stuff and the stuff designed to clickbait you and get you to click on it. Like, man, you can't. The nice thing about Twitter is you can do it from your desktop. So, like, you can just schedule, like, hey, every Thursday at 3 p.m. or whatever, I go on Twitter and I tweet and I answer questions and whatever, and then you're off. Instagram's the harder one because it's on your phone. I've just pretty much decided I'm going to go on like once or twice to Instagram, and then I'm going to delete the app off of my phone and then just re-upload it a week later or 3 days later or whatever. So it's just not there as a distraction.
It's funny for me, Instagram, somebody talked me into getting it. It took them 2 years to wear me down. Finally, I got it like a year ago.
Yeah.
I hardly ever, I have to like remind myself to
Yeah.
post something once a month. So that's good. But Twitter
No,
is
you don't, Preston. You don't even have to be on it. You don't have to remind yourself. I
well,
just read Jared Lanier's new book, 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts Right Now.
really?
It's a great read. Yeah, and a great, I mean, he's one of the Silicon Valley originals, one of the
Huh,
founders, and has
really?
become a really big critic of social media and what he calls bummer, the way that everything is, designed for attention, the
Yeah.
attention economy,
So for me, so I mean, I run a nonprofit. That's my job, my livelihood, and everything. So,
Yeah,
and I don't want to, and because it's a self-funded nonprofit, basically, if I want to have a marketing budget, that means I have to like speak 4 extra times. I have money,
yeah,
like, and
totally.
well, I don't want to do that. Like, I
Twitter
just
is your
rely
marketing
on
budget.
what's
Yeah,
that?
Twitter is your marketing budget.
Totally. So, but yeah, my
Yeah,
point is, and this was the advice I got from others who aren't like hyper pro social media, but they're like, for what you're doing, you kind of do need to
yeah.
be on these. I mean, you could not,
Yep.
but I mean, that's good. It is going to affect the very nature of what you're doing. So,
But so then the question becomes, how do you use social media as a tool and not be used by it? Because it is intentionally, it's not designed for you to market the Center for Faith and Sexuality, which is a great thing. It's designed to steal your attention and
yeah,
distract you and addict you in order to manipulate you through advertising from third party people to get you to vote a certain way, think a certain way, and buy a whole bunch of
yeah.
products that you don't need. That's what it's actually designed for.
What's
So
funny
you have
is,
to find out a way to use it not for what it's for, but for what it has the potential to do as a side
yeah.
effect, which is social media.
Well, and I feel like for me, when it comes to Facebook and Instagram, it's a huge win, 100%. I don't get distracted. I mean, maybe I would say maybe I probably check Facebook twice a month. And maybe once every 2 months, I'll get sucked into like a couple things for about 10 minutes. That's about it.
Yep.
Twitter is the one that they've got me. They've
Yeah,
conquered
they
me.
got
They've
you.
distracted
But
me.
just getting it off your phone is such a huge win. And then if you just do it on your desktop and limit, even if you do it every day, like limit it every day, like every day at from 4 to 4:30, I'm on Twitter or whatever. Awesome. That's great.
What they don't realize is all the far left stuff that keeps being thrown at me is actually making me more conservative. Like, wait, I don't think it, some of the far left movements I see are actually, in my opinion, going to put Trump back in the office. Because
Yeah,
when
I
you
absolutely
criticize,
agree. But
when
part of the
Iran
problem
shoots,
there is social media is designed to get the farthest extreme on either side and the most incendiary comments because that's how it drives user engagement.
really,
So you're not at, that's why, I mean, you read the More in Common study, I'm sure, last year, and these studies keep coming
no,
out. There's
which
another one
one's
after.
that? Which one's that?
You can just Google it, More in Common. It was a great sociological survey done of the political landscape in America. And, there's a bunch of different surveys. Andrew Sullivan had a good survey of it. David Brooks had a great summary of it. And you can actually just go read the raw data. And basically, this is my interpretation of it, is that if all you had was Twitter, you would think that everybody was either a super woke far left
Yeah,
person or like an old white, evangelical racist. And basically they said that doesn't remotely capture the reality. They broke America into 6 different political tribes, and they said that the far right, I think they called them the alt-right, and I think they called it progressive activists, was the far left,
yeah,
are the 2 smallest groups. They're like 7% and 6% of the population, respectively. And they are also the whitest, wealthiest,
yeah.
and most educated of all groups. So, in particular, the only group that was whiter than progressive activists was the alt-right. And so they basically concluded that progressive activists don't actually speak for most people of color, don't actually speak on behalf of the poor. If you actually look at what most brown people and black people and indigenous people like think at a political level, they're not represented by that. Contrary, I mean, the majority of them are not represented. So it basically just upended a lot of assumptions, and at the same time made sense of like, most people I meet aren't like crazy leftists or
Right.
crazy alt-right racists. Most people are just like confused and in the middle and trying to get
Yeah.
groceries for the weekend,
How do you spell that again? The study,
More in common. Just
MORAN.
yeah, more in common.
Oh,
Like
more in common,
like
more
we
in.
have more in common. I think the heart was like to show people we actually aren't as divided as Twitter would make you think. We actually have more in common than you would imagine.
I did remember coming across. See, I was looking for this actually because I kept hearing some podcasters refer to it, but they never gave the name. Um, that no, that's so funny because yeah, I see that anecdotally as well. I mean, you're in Portland, right? The most progressive activist city in America, and it's also extremely white, right?
Yeah, 100%. It's the whitest big city in America.
And people can afford to drink $5 coffees and go out to expensive restaurants and
Yeah.
afford to eat healthy and all that.
Well, some people can. Not the whole city's not. It's
Right.
not a super wealthy city, but yes.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Let's talk about culture for a second. See, I mean, you and Mark Sayers. Thank you for introducing me to Mark. I had him on my
Yeah.
podcast last summer.
What a gem he is.
Dude, how can we get his? I mean, he would probably not want this, but I just want his voice to be heard by more people, and it seems like it's growing for sure. But
Yeah, that was really one of my main agendas with that podcast was the same. Like everybody needs to know about this guy and everybody
yeah,
needs to listen to what he's saying.
where do you see culture going? So right now it is so volatile and angry and polarized, and to me, I find it fascinating. Like, where in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, like, where are we gonna be? Have you thought? Did you feel? Do you like to think ahead on kind of where are things going? Because it seems like we're at a tipping point with some some things right now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's over my pay grade. That's a good question for Mark. I'm not, yeah, I don't know. I don't want to get anxious about it. I'm not optimistic. I don't
Really?
think that like I mean, it would be amazing. Maybe we'll get just a good, moderate president in, and everybody will calm down, and Facebook and Instagram will turn over to a $10 a month different business plan that won't reward, this kind of polarizing, incendiary, anger and anxiety based, social media thing, and families will get back together and parent their children, and kids will grow up just feeling safe and at peace and clear in who they are, and but I just it's hard for me to imagine that happening. I do think that the far left will burn out. And, it's funny, I was touring the local high school. We're trying to decide if we're going to put our oldest boy in the public high school or not. And we've sadly concluded that it's so far left. It's into indoctrination, not education anymore. So we're not going to. But I was touring his high school, and there were Foucault quotes on pretty much every wall. Who, if you don't know who that is, he's a French philosopher who basically was the founder of postmodernism and critical theory. So a lot of the stuff that we hear about postmodernism and power and intersectionality theory and all the critical gender theory and critical queer theory all kind of goes back to a lot of his mind. And he's a brilliant thinker.
Yeah.
But he had this great line, I think it was him, that was in quotes, "Where there's power, there is resistance." And I thought that's a really true statement. But now the power is in the hands of, the secular leftist elites. And so there's going to be resistance. I think you're going to see a shocking Gen Z swing back to the kind of Ben Shapiro's of the world. But it'll be a secular, angry return. It's not like you know what I mean? Not like a
Yeah.
return to kind, thoughtful,
Yeah.
Christians or whatever, I think.
Well, I feel like and maybe it's just the
Hopefully I'm
world
wrong,
that I live in
but
with LGBT stuff, but there's such a so LGB activism, marriage equality, all these things, a lot of just the standard liberals we're all totally on board with.
yeah,
But now there's a lot of backlash against some of the extreme activisms, some surrounding the T,
yeah,
and by people who are transgender. Okay, I mean, again, like you said before, there's a small number of loud activists that are kind of speaking for the whole group, but there's a growing number of even trans people, but also liberal people, gay people, especially lesbians, who are speaking
yes.
out saying we fought for decades for certain human equality, but now there's certain radical activists that are
I
just
mean, they seem ideologically completely incompatible to me,
right. Yeah. Well, it's
Feminism, women's
denying basic
rights.
scientific categories, and it's like a lot of liberals, very liberal people, are like, this extreme activism has gone so far. Now we're shooting ourselves in the foot because now we look like we're flat earthers by denying some really basic things that the average human being is not going to go with. So I don't. I even look at like look at the growing number. It seems like a growing number of comedians who are kind of speaking out against hyper
Yeah, and I've always said that
sexualization.
the good comedians are like secular prophets. They function, I think, in that prophetic role of critiquing
Yeah.
culture from the inside.
I mean, look at like Ricky Gervais's monologue. Did you see that?
I didn't see that
Oh,
last
you
week at the.
guys. I was, my jaw's on the ground saying, this is remarkable. He basically, at the what's it called, the Golden Globe Awards, the ones that nobody really cares about except for the people that attend. Um, he, in a very funny comedic way, pretty much laid into Hollywood and saying, "You guys are a bunch of moral hypocrites. When you come get your award, take your little award, sit down, shut up, don't make a political speech because nobody respects your kind of inconsistent morals. You know, you have no place to
Yeah.
speak to people in the real." I was like,
Oh my goodness, it's nice to hear that. I mean, Me Too to me was just such a fascinating moral thing. Like of all people, I mean, to have Hollywood attempt to advocate for like women's rights. I mean, I was just shocked. I'm like you literally have done more to degrade and objectify women than any
right.
community in history, practically. That's probably an overstatement, but
So I feel like
just
there's
in
more and more
history.
people that are finally starting to speak, because I feel like the average person knows that, but now more and more people, or even Dave Chappelle. I don't know if you saw his recent
Yeah,
thing.
but he got crucified though, I mean, and J.K. Rowling last week came out, against as a turf, and came
Yeah,
out against some, there's a doctor in the UK that was fired because he refused to negate biological sex,
right.
and a woman that was fired, and so she spoke out on grounds of feminism, but then she's just crucified,
But what is she? Here's the thing. I think she was
Yeah, but I
crucified
don't think
by a
she's
very
actually
loud
crucified by the
minority.
majority of people. She's crucified by the internet, you
Right.
know?
So Ricky Gervais got crucified by certain journalists, but then he gained 300,000 followers on Twitter the next day. So I think the massive or even Dave Chappelle, certain people were just horrified at his speech.
Yes.
But it is incredibly popular, and like, and this is where maybe going back to that more in common study, I think that the majority of people who might be very just liberal in their morals or whatever, um, are not really on board with this capital W woke kind of culture. I don't know if we need to make a distinction for our audience on that, but
Yeah, and unfortunately, it blends together things like racial justice with sexuality, which is such a,
right,
and then it brings blends LGB stuff with T stuff, and so unfortunately, all this stuff gets put together that are really fairly different categories, and I think should be
yeah,
thought about in some pretty different ways at times.
yeah,
So yeah, I mean, so yes, I don't think things are going to keep going left, 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 left. But unfortunately, the reactions that you're mentioning often tend to be angry, unkind, and unchristian reactions.
hmm,
And so that's where it's the ping pong effect that, social
yeah,
media exacerbates, because that's how social media drives engagement, is through the ping pong thing. So you get this hard left, hard right, and mocking each other, and I think more and more people are just confused. And I mean, what is all critical gender theory around trans stuff? I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's just people are confused about what it means to be a human being,
right,
and what the meaning and purpose of life is and what the telos of life is. These are
hmm,
central human questions that you cannot not ask.
yeah,
So, I mean, my dream is that I'm going to go back and reread Failure of Nerve this year with my elders and staff, which is Edward and Friedman's book. He's the one who coined the phrase non-anxious presence. So there's
yeah.
two books that we're going to, I think, go back and reread as a staff this year. One is Coddling of the American Mind. I don't know if you read that last year,
Best
which
book of
was,
2019.
yes,
Oh,
so helpful. And then we're going to reread Failure of Nerve by Edwin Freeman, and just I think trying to ask the question, how do we as a community become a community of stability and non-anxious presence and love and wisdom in the middle of this culture that's falling apart? And that's where many have pointed out, Patrick Deneen, Rod Dreyer, and many others have pointed out the parallels between our current cultural moment and kind of the 4th and 5th century AD and the decline of the Roman Empire,
yeah,
as the Visigoths sacked Rome, and the Roman Empire, which was once this bastion of order and wealth and Pax Romana just began to fall apart, and there was chaos, and there were warlords, and it was dangerous. And these monasteries, that's where the monastic movement came from. They became these centers of stability in a world gone mad. Like, you go to medieval Europe and you'll see monasteries that have like turrets, you know what I mean? Like they look like castles and turrets. And part of you thinks that's horrible. Like, how far, how much do you have to lose the plot line from Jesus to like have a turret and a moat and a dungeon in your church, But then you think about, so it's easy for me to judge, but then I think about, how would I create a community of Jesus that does, that is a bastion for the common good if I was in a failed state like Mogadishu or the Congo or Syria right now? You would probably put up some walls and lock them. You know what I mean? You'd probably have to have somewhere to put people that are dangerous, And it's like, it's easy for me to judge, but then I think, oh man, like there's something here, And so I wonder, I'm not saying we should build castles, but I do think that whatever the future is for the church, it's a neo-monastic, kind of anti-digital, intensely relational, intensely disciplined, discipleship-based kind of rigorous community. And my hope is that it operates as some kind of a center of stability in a world that is increasingly kind of gone mad.
That's fascinating. Is that the Benedict option were you referring to?
Yeah, which again, when that book came out, it got a lot of flack, and I read it and was like, oh, it's good, but really dour. And it's so funny, I just reread it this last year with a bunch of my friends, 3-4 years later, and culture has gone so much crazier since the Trump election and since the far left and since all the, gender stuff, that all of a sudden it just made it sounded like perfect sense. It's like, yeah, that's exactly where we're at. It sounded like this really harbinger of doom. And now I'm like, yeah, that's basically life right now.
So I need to read that. I've been dying to read. I've been intrigued by the idea. I'm not sure. I don't know what to think.
Well, it's not the kind of book you read and agree with everything. So the Benedict doctrine by Rod Dreher, and then even better, very similar, but even better, though less Christian, is Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick Deneen, one of the most influential political books I've ever read in my life. And it's not about politics like partisan politics. It's about political philosophy and how we got here and what's the future. Two harbinger of doom books and two very intelligent books. In particular, Deneen's work is just, if you're not familiar with him, Google Patrick Deneen, Deneen. He's a political philosopher from Notre Dame. I think he's a conservative Catholic, though he doesn't talk as a religious person, so I'm not sure. And you can listen to podcasts and interviews with both of them. And Deneen's harder to understand because he's wicked smart, but his thinking around this is hyper influential on how I'm thinking about this. And neither of them hold out much hope for the future. So, David Brooks and others would be more hopeful for the future. And I don't know, that's just over my pay grade. All I know is that I think for whatever the future of the church is, it's either back to a rigorous discipleship, neo-monastic, communal kind of life, or it's obliteration on the right or the left, because the right is corroding faith just as much as the left is now. So, the old stereotypes are breaking down.
Yeah, for me, because I came from the right, I would even say far right, I sometimes take for granted that that's kind of a bankrupt direction. And that's why more recently, because I have on the spectrum in my life trajectory, it was like far right, moving more left, and now just moderate. And right now, I don't know, right of center. I don't love those categories at all. But to me, sometimes I forget to even critique the far right because it's just so self-evidently, but that's just context too. So some people that weren't raised in the far right maybe only critique the far right because it's more.
So much of it's your context. Again, I don't even think about it because it's just not the world I live in,
Yeah. So the church moving forward, I am interested in this. I don't know. It sounds so basic, so just like New Testament-ish, but the church does need to be intentionally countercultural on several different levels. Even take something like sexuality. We think that the church has a conservative sexual ethic, but we've basically adopted a secular sexual ethic and added one little footnote: wait until you're married. That's it. But
Yeah.
we still have the same view of our weddings look the same. We spend the same amount of money. There's no
Yep.
sacramentalism in our
And then
weddings.
even, I mean, if you look at the right and the conservative, I mean, I'm not sure that it's all that different sex ethic other than some of the views around gender and gender, you know, stereotypes or whatever. But as far as like premarital sex, I mean, I don't know that it's any different on the right than on the left, you know,
Statistically, it's not even. But even if we say no, don't have sex till you get married, we still have a very secular view of sex. It's the
yeah.
same view of it's largely for pleasure, procreation. Yeah,
Yep.
sure, if you want, but there's no problem. Stop. I mean, how was I raised for all these years without even raising a moral question about separating sex from procreation? Like that. That's just nothing.
Yeah.
But
How did that not even come into that? Wasn't even a question. Yeah.
that's like one of the most basic, like scientific things that.
And nobody even really had the option to separate those things
Right.
until, you know, our parents, really.
But because we can, therefore it's morally right. And it's like, what kind of ethic? It's bizarre to me how blindly we have adopted.
So have you rethought your theology of birth control?
Yeah, not completely, but
Do you have podcasts I can listen to on that, or what's the Cliff Notes version? I'd love. That's been like an open question in my. I feel like the way about birth control that I used to feel about nonviolence, like before I studied it.
Yeah,
Like
totally.
I don't really want to study it because I'm afraid that I'm probably wrong. But nobody around me is questioning my theology, so I'm just gonna stay in my bubble.
I don't have it totally ironed out at all. But I wonder if the Catholics are more right than wrong. Here's where I'm at now. If a Christian couple said we want to get married, but we don't want to have biological kids, not infertile, but like, we're going to take steps to not have biological kids, I would say the moral burden rests on you to justify that position. I can't just say, oh, cool, that's totally fine. I would say I would at least raise the moral question, justify that morally, that you're going to separate marriage from having kids. You're going to have sex, you're going to get married, and that vocation, that calling is disconnected from kids. At least convince me of that. Don't just assume that that's totally fine. That's where I'd be at right now. I wouldn't say it's immoral necessarily, but I would I think we just need to think more deeply about haphazardly separating sex from procreation. Now that raises questions. Well, what if you have 8 kids, or 9, like the health of the mother, and is there ever a place for family planning within?
Yeah, and what about climate
those are all really
change and urban centers and cost of living and
Totally. I think that I don't think we realize.
But again, I mean, sometimes I wonder, are those just the people like hearing a biblical theology of nonviolence and being like, yeah, but what? Like North Korea would take over America and we'd all be speaking Arabic, people, they don't want to have the conversation. So sometimes I wonder, am I that person? And I'm just like, well, yeah, but I'd have 13 kids and my wife would be dead, and you know what I mean, and I wouldn't be able to afford anything, and
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I definitely don't think that Genesis 1, the blessing, be fruitful, multiply, is a binding command in perpetuity. I can't get there exegetically. But it does seem like, to go against that, you're going against the natural Trinitarian biological flow of life in you. Mm-hmm. That God created, the Trinitarian God created man and woman to come together to go from otherness to union, and then to spill out in Trinitarian love, which requires a third, which requires a child. So that flow of life, of not being one person, but coming together as two, and then creating a third in order to move from egoistic kind of narcissistic control to agape, which is the spiritual journey. That impulse, like, to go against that, feels like almost like you're going against the Trinitarian flow in you,
That's beautiful, man. No, that's exactly.
But I could be wrong. But then my question is, like, but once you've had a child, do you have to keep having children, and does that mean all have to? I mean, I don't. Are there other ways to let the Trinitarian flow through you in your marriage? With, I think Jesus models that at some level.
I do think there is some discontinuity between marriage and procreation in the Old Testament and in the New. For instance, in the Old, you have laws set up to where if your brother dies childless,
yeah, which is a beautiful law.
Right.
Well, seriously, I just taught on that. I just taught on that 2 days ago, actually. Or I taught on Jesus' line to the Pharisees about that. I mean, that's actually a compelling act of social justice for women and care for women in that day and age.
Yeah, and that's it. I think there are certain social structures and differences back then that aren't here today, and how
Yes.
much of those commands were intertwined with the social structure that
And the agrarian economy, you know what I mean? And
yeah,
that's one of the big, I was chatting to a therapist about this recently and just saying one of the big challenges for parents now is that in a urban information economy, children are a burden.
yeah, yeah,
They're a drain on the family's resources. They don't contribute. They're not needed. And so that creates not only narcissism in the kids, but it actually creates low self-esteem. So why is the suicide rate highest among teenagers and elderly people? Most people say it's because they're not contributing in any way. And there's a fascinating psychologist I read recently who basically said that 0 to 3, self-esteem is a function of unconditional love. But after that, self-esteem is basically a function of contribution to a social group. Meaning, from the time you're like in kindergarten on, you basically feel happy and good about yourself, not just from unconditional love from your parents, but actually from contributing something to your family, your church, your village, your tribe, your whatever, and just helping out. And this is why, like kids that come from big families and live on farms tend to be the happiest, most well adjusted, least narcissistic people I know. There's
yeah,
just something
yeah,
about that, that does good to the soul that kids growing up and but more like my kids life just really struggle to become those kinds of people. So it's a massive parenting question I'm asking right now. How do I artificially create for my urban kids, middle class kids, what they would have had if they were like one of 10 kids on a farm and had to get up and milk the cows every morning? How do I
that's so
artificially
good.
create that? That's actually the question I'm asking as a parent right now.
Oh gosh, I ask that question almost every day. I know. Because I mean, we live in Idaho, where there's a big farming community, so we still have a residue of some of that. You can tell
Yes.
the difference between teenagers that were literally raised on a farm, or still on a
Yep.
farm, versus those that are.
And do you see a similar effect, like a positive effect on their
Oh yeah,
personhood?
they're kinder, they're less selfless. They'll stop and it's not uncommon for if you're broken down or something for somebody, for a teenager. I mean, this is a true story. We were camping last summer, and one couple blew a tire, didn't have a spare. We were 2 hours from the city, and these two teenage boys that were just out fishing basically devoted their entire day to driving this guy around, trying to find a camper that had an extra tire. I was going to give
Sheesh.
an extra tire for my car, it didn't fit, so then we found this old broken down car. And they were kind. They were just and yeah, they were just
Yep.
good old boys. And they didn't even think these were teenagers, like, and they just gave up on themselves. And yeah, they were literally like, yeah, hey, where are you from? They named some community that has like population 78 or something.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't know. It's so hard to duplicate that in the rhythms of life. But it's funny. We have a community group. We call it Simple Church, that meets every other week. And our group has 6 families, and each family has about 3 or 4 teenagers. It's
Mm-hmm.
a really interesting community group with loads of
Yeah, I would
teenagers.
imagine.
And we have a big basement in our house. And this last Sunday night, typically the kids are off like playing games, playing ping pong, hanging out, doing whatever, running around, and then the adults are kind of praying together, whatever. And we keep saying, like, we need to like not let's bring it together. So we bring all the kids up, and instead of like sharing prayer requests, my wife throws out a question. She said, it was all quiet, and we're like, hey, I got a question. What do you guys think about abortion? Like, have you? And the kids, they all lit up. They all had strong, well thought out opinions, both from the pro-life side to like, what about the shame that covers the person that actually gets an abortion? In other words, like, yeah, we've been talking about this in government, and I have no place where I can kind of like express my opinion. I'll get screamed at or whatever. And they were. I've never seen these teenagers so engaged because they were contributing to the conversation, to the
Yep.
group. But it just goes back to your point, that idea of actually feeling like your role is meaningful, like you have something to contribute. This
And
community
we need you.
not
Yep.
be
Not just we love you, we need you.
right. Yes. Gosh. And how to duplicate that in white middle class, iPhone saturated. Well, dude, it's coming up on an hour. We should probably start wrapping things up.
Well, man, I could chat to you for hours. You're always such a delightful hang. Thanks for having me on and letting me ramble.
Dude, my pleasure. So I want to mention, let's see. I got your Okay, yeah. So the Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, your latest book. Your one before that, God Has a Name. The one before that, Garden City, Work, Rest, and I can't see
The
the
Art
subtitle.
of Being Human. That's okay.
Art,
You don't need to hawk my stuff. It's okay. It's good. Your
dude,
parents
your
did it for
titles
me, you
kill
know?
it. And then Loveology and others. Are you working on anything right now? Can you talk about it, or no? Are you done for a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know that I don't know if I'm allowed to now. Yeah, I actually have already written the next book. So,
Are you serious?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
I think you're supposed to kind of keep it on the DL. Yeah, no, the next one's already written. Yep, ready to roll.
Can you talk about what the topic is, or no? That's totally fine.
Well, I don't want to. I don't even know if. Well, yes, it's a weird book. It's totally different. I'll probably sell 3 copies, but I think it's by far my most interesting one. It is an attempt to take the historic ancient church category of the world, the flesh, and the devil, and
Oh
to
yeah.
update it for the kind of secular, educated,
Really?
post-Christian worldview.
Flying. So, John, thanks so much for being on Theology in the Raw. We'll have to have you on again for a third time sometime.
Thanks, man. It's always a pleasure.
All right, take care.